Hey Simone,
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us.
That's okay.
I'm just
Well,
logging in our other friends and panelists, so bear with me.
no worries.
Won't be a moment.
Hey Bamboo
But
Traveler, Bamboo. They're saying we can see you both. Yes, we're aware. We just got a few other people we're trying to get on as well.
we are, bear with us.
But maybe while we're waiting, if you want to post some stuff in the comments about some things you'd love us to talk about tonight, that'd be interesting just to see what's on your mind. I saw someone said they were interested in us talking about Iran and what's happening over there.
Okay. Just bear with us as we are just linking in the last of our panelists and getting ready for our 8 p.m. kickoff.
Hey Tarang,
Hey, how are you?
good mate. How are you?
I'm good. Are you Matt?
Yes, I am. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You're
I
dialing in
wasn't
from your
gonna
car.
talk about ending men's violence against women. So I'm gonna that's the priority. I'm gonna make that. I'm gonna pull over. I'm gonna find a place with decent lighting, and I'm gonna make sure I show up for this.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you made that choice as well. Um, I just got some comments. Coping with judgment, trusting and self-knowledge. Cool. We just invited some people to post in the comments some stuff they'd like us to talk about and different
Oh, for
questions or
sure.
topics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I've never done an Instagram live before in my
Me
whole life.
either.
Yeah, I've never done one. Never done one.
Well,
Neither
thankfully
have
we've got a
I,
really
so we can all.
supportive crowd as
Oh,
well. So
we're
everyone's helping
all
us out.
figuring it out.
Lizzie's saying hi to you right now.
Oh,
I can't
hi.
really pronounce.
Oh, that's Liz Cleary. I know who that is. Liz's elder sister Vicky tragically had her life taken from her in 1987, and Lizzie and her brother Phil and the whole family have advocated for 3.5 decades now. So just remarkable.
That is remarkable. Spot on. There you go. Lizzie just agreed with you. Getting a lot of love on here, Tarang. I mean, obviously you do amazing work. I've been following your work for a while as well. I got to say, I'm a bit of a fan as well.
No, I love what you guys do at the Man Cave. Yeah, just such an important part of supporting boys and men is preventative work rather than just trying to pick up the pieces. Nothing. We had pastoral care through the school, which was run by the geography teacher, and he used that opportunity to teach us more geography.
Oh God.
So that was a kind of commitment. So it's actually, frankly, remarkable that my mental health is where it's at now, because it wasn't to do with school in that regard.
Yeah. Where'd you
What
grow
about
up?
yourself? I grew up in Melbourne.
Oh, awesome. I thought
Yeah,
so.
I grew up in Melbourne. Where did you
Um,
have a program?
no, I didn't. I think I learnt more about um, the work we're doing now through cadets, sport,
Oh yeah, yeah.
um, a bit of scuba diving with my dad, and
Oh
then
yeah,
just the play with the local girls' school or the year
yeah,
eight school dance, which was the most
yeah,
awkward thing I've ever been to.
yeah,
Literally had the girls on one side of the room and the boys on the other side of the room,
yeah,
and just had to work out how to socialize. So
yeah.
no,
It's
nothing in
yeah,
particular.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I actually went back to my old high school today to talk to the Year 10 boys, and that's why I left with a profound, growing respect of the work that you all do, because teenage boys are by far the toughest crowd going around.
Yeah.
Right? Like if one gag falls flat, that's it. You've lost their respect, right? And you've got to claw it back. So
yeah, which I think actually speaks to a reflection I've been having more generally, which is this idea of masculinity being really hard to earn and really easy to lose as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Really well put as well.
I'm the same as you, mate. I've facilitated quite a bit, and still when I get back into a room with 30 or 40 boys, all my teen angst comes up. I'm like, all right, just need to let that go.
Yeah.
And they're just testing. Absolutely. I think that most of the time they're just testing us for safety and trust. Like, can I trust you?
Yeah.
Is this just going to be another program, or are we actually going to have a discussion, a conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of like, am I going to get anything from you, or are you here to tell me off? Because boys are so used to being, I think, told off, right? That don't do that, or you're doing the wrong thing, or there's a lot of like, boys don't cry, boys don't do this, as opposed to boys can.
Yeah, agreed. And they have a lot of things said to them, about them, at them, but not a lot of conversations had with them. Yeah. We had a program last year in Frankston at a school that had some really big challenges with, obviously really challenging home environments for a lot of them. And our facilitators just half an hour in could just sense the boys weren't engaged. And they're like, hey, we're not from here. Can you tell us what it's like to live in Frankston? And the boys were like, well, I walk home from school in the afternoon and I see blood on the pavement. Like, it doesn't feel very safe. And they just spent the next 30 or 40 minutes just letting the boys tell them about what it's like to actually live where they lived, and sort of met them where they're at and had a conversation. And then the boys were interested in hearing what our team had to say. But you got to give a little bit before you start giving advice to the boys. Yeah.
They've never had space to talk, right? Like, they've never, and it's because of the harmful constructs, I would say. I think Professor Mark Flood just joined us. At least
I just saw the XY. That's him, isn't it?
I think that's him.
That is great. Sorry, Professor Flood, but I've been trying to find you, and it's I've had a bit of trouble. So hopefully I can add you in now, and we'll be ready to go. Keep talking amongst yourselves, guys. It's really interesting listening to your chat anyway.
Thanks.
Now I need to find where he's gone. There we are.
Well, it's a full circle moment for you going back to your school today, Tarang. It's really special.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really. And like, so nice because like one of my favorite teachers, she gets her phone out at the end and she's showing me like, that she's got a 14-year-old girl now, daughter, and kind of telling me about that. Just beautiful.
That's beautiful.
Okay. Hey there. Thanks so much. Sorry, we had a few technical difficulties, but I think we are now ready to go. And thanks for those who have joined us now online on what is my first Instagram Live. So bear with me, but I think we're getting the technology. So we might kick off if everyone's good to go. My name's Simone Clarke. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for UN Women here in Australia. And before we start with our panel and my introductions, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining you from this evening, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thanks everyone who's joined us online. I'm getting lots of waves and a lot of interest on the panel this evening, which is really reassuring. I think it's going to be a really lively conversation. But enough from me. What I will do firstly to kick off is to introduce our wonderful panelists and to thank them for their time and the contribution to what I'm sure will be a really interesting conversation. So I might just start in no particular order, but firstly with Tarang Chawla, who is an activist, a campaigner and a founder of Not One More Nikki. Tarang is also a Victorian Multicultural Commissioner, a sessional academic at Monash University, and is on the board of the Australian Republican Movement. In 2022, Tarang hosted There's No Place Like Home. This was a double award-winning podcast about domestic abuse and has been named a Young Australian of the Year finalist, the Young Community Achiever of the Year award winner. He's been twice listed as one of the top 25 most influential people working for social change, and is one of Australia's top 40, under 40 most influential Asian Australians. So we are absolutely delighted, Tarang, that you could join us this evening, and thanks so much for being part of this conversation. So welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Professor Michael Flood, who is a professor in the School of Justice at QUT. Dr. Flood has a long, illustrious and well-published career in this space and a contribution to scholarly and community education research and understanding of men's and boys' involvement in preventing violence against women, and has done a series of published journals, as well as is an author, a co-author, and the list goes on. And I probably can't do him justice in the short time I have to introduce him, but I'm also delighted to say that recently Professor Flood was also engaged by UN Women to assist us with a major report around how we engage and engaging men in violence prevention, masculinity, and gender justice. So on behalf of UN Women, I'd like to thank you as well, Dr. Professor Flood. It's an absolute delight to have this with you. And finally, and by no means least, I would like to welcome Matt Defina, who has joined us from the Man Cave. And I'm really happy that you could join us this evening, because much like Tarang in the earlier conversation amongst those who were yet to join us, the Man Cave does some exceptional work in this space as well. Hailing from Victoria, Matt is a registered psychologist, using his studies to gain knowledge and skills in ethical psychology practice, gender stereotypes and leadership. And really, very importantly, how to create organisational and communities that bring out the best in people, an incredible purpose and life application. Matt changed gears, as I understand it, from being a business consultant and moved into this space to take on his role as the head of Impact at the Man Cave. And through the Man Cave, Matt is now obviously committed to helping young men experience and expand their view of what is possible in their life for them and in their communities, and also their relationship with others. So on behalf of UN Women and all the audience joining us here tonight, welcome. Thank you so much for your time, and looking forward to having an interesting chat. Just before we kick off, I might throw first to you, Professor Flood, just to give us a bit of context around terminology. We hear a lot about gender-based violence, violence against women, men's violence. Do they all mean the same thing? And is it important that we are really clear about what it is we're talking about this evening? So maybe just to provide some context for those who are joining us around just some of that very basic terminology, but can mean so many different things to so many different audiences.
Sure. Look, there is an issue that there's lots of different terms out there, and whatever language we use, it's going to include some forms of violence and exclude others. So, let's take the phrase domestic violence, for example. It doesn't name that the perpetrators of that violence often are men and the victims often are women. The phrase violence against women names who the victims are, but of course excludes violence against men. Phrases like gender-based violence may be misunderstood. I think initially that phrase gender-based violence began as a way to name men's violence against women and how it was linked to gender inequalities. But increasingly it's been used in kind of fluffier ways. So, I'm not hell-bent on insisting on any particular term. I suppose we just have to be aware that whatever language we use, whether we talk about men's violence against women or about domestic, family and sexual violence, those terms will name some forms of violence, but they may obscure or minimise other forms of violence.
And it's interesting that you touch on that, because I know some of the social commentary leading up to tonight's Instagram session, there were some comments about violence against men as well. And obviously we're not wanting to preclude that, but for the sake of this conversation, we might sort of just narrow it down to specifically around violence against women, given that we are within the 16 days of activism sort of global space at the moment, which is really looking to how we engaged men and women in our movement and our mission to try and reduce the impact of violence in whatever form and shape it takes against women. So thanks for that clarification. Tarang, you have a very personal journey in this space. You were talking about it as we sort of kicked off. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what's brought you to where you are, your passion, your involvement, and obviously your story in terms of the impact and what you have seen in and across and through that journey.
Yeah, what a great question. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to this Instagram live call. I don't know what we call it, but coming from Naarm, Melbourne, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge the disproportionate impact statistically and also in many other myriad ways that men's violence against women has on First Nations communities, and that violence is not, as is sometimes thought of in the mainstream, as being committed by Aboriginal men against women, but by Anglo-Celtic men against Aboriginal women, and there's intersectional complexities in how we respond to that violence. My public-facing advocacy really kicked off following the murder of my little sister Nikki, or Nikita, in 2015, and it was sort of spurred on by obviously her death, but as a way of trying to, on a personal level and also on a familial one, reclaim a degree of space, reclaim a degree of agency and autonomy, particularly because some of the narratives that were in the public sphere about her blamed her more so than the perpetrator. And I had a fundamental issue with that as a general concept, that we see women being blamed for the criminal actions of male perpetrators of abuse and violence, and so that really kind of got to me at a visceral level, and I felt a need to speak out about it. Other factors as well at the time were the way that our cultural ethnicity was brought into the fore, as though that was somehow a significant exacerbating factor, or in some cases a contributing factor, rather than elements of male entitlement, power imbalance, the views of women generally that the perpetrator had then and may still have now. And so it was a combination of those factors, and also spurred on, I think, in some part from my upbringing. My sister and I were raised in a household where we saw a more equal division of labour. We saw, the way that my father treated my mum, and still does, with respect and with equality. And this was obviously extremely counter to that. And also just a personal journey I went on when I was studying at university. I, out of interest, took gender studies subjects and ended up just adding a major in that, because growing up as a South Asian brown-skinned man in very white areas and white neighborhoods, I didn't feel a sense of belonging. So I wanted to figure out my own sense of masculinity. And I was pretty comfortable in that in my own life. But following Nikki's murder, I was just spurred on by all the things I talked about before to speak out more publicly.
Yeah, fascinating. It's quite a journey. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And we'll come back to a bit more about some of those cultural implications and that sort of intersectionality piece as well a little bit later. Matt, really interesting to talk to you about the work that Man Cave does, and if you can share with obviously those on the Instagram feed this evening about some of the work that you do and some of the initiatives around particularly working with young men and boys who are often quite challenged by either having a space to even talk around these things, but also how they then react and how they then form and develop their own views around that. So if you can share with the audience a little bit about what you do and some of the great work that you do, because it really is, when I first heard about it, really super impressed that these programs were even in place for young boys and men.
Thanks, Simone. Yeah, awesome to see everyone tonight. And I'll add a caveat as well. I'd really love to have a really open conversation tonight and go to the places maybe that are a bit edgy, and we might not always get it right. So I just want to put that out there as well. But I feel like for conversations like this to not be so polished, and for us to sort of talk about what's really going on, just permission to sort of go there and get to the edgy parts. But I'll talk about Man Cave. So we really started Man Cave in 2014 because we just recognized that as men ourselves, we never had the chance at school to talk openly about what was actually happening in our lives. And so most of us, if not all of us, were walking around school with these masks on, with this armor on, pretending we're all good, when actually stuff was happening at home that we'd never spoken about. And so we ran our first pilot program, which was only a couple of hours. We called it the Man Cave because we thought if we called it the Feelings Cave, not many boys are going to turn up. And it's not really that appealing to a teenager. So we called it the Man Cave to play on the idea of what it means, but also to create this idea of psychological safety, of what's possible when you create a safe space for young men to talk openly. And so we brought in male role models that can represent diverse ranges of healthy masculinity, especially being in Victoria, and then also giving them basic tools, basic permission and space to talk about what's happening in their lives. So that was 2014. We've now worked with 36,000 young men across Victoria, New South Wales, and a few other states. And really what I've seen is that when we do create the space, and these programs are full day programs, we're not just going in for a 90-minute keynote. It's a full day with 30 or 40 boys, 2 or 3 facilitators, really guiding these boys on a journey to start to open up and realize that they can talk openly in front of each other. It is safe to do so, and they can live that way. The masculinity doesn't have to be about always acting tough and showing no emotion. The gender landscape has changed a lot in the last few years as well, though. And we're seeing that really with young men. It's been a really confusing time for them. So, yeah, it'd be a really interesting conversation tonight. And I think the main thing that I really love about our work is that we approach it from a strengths lens. We acknowledge there's really important work being done at the crisis management side of things. But I love our work because it focuses on the preventative end and it focuses on strengths and really empowering young men to step into their full selves.
Yeah, great. Absolutely. And I think I just wanted to pick up on something you said, which was, you know, let's maybe go to those possibly darker, more complex, more challenging spaces for us around this conversation, irrespective of gender and in the whole notion of violence and how that manifests itself. Professor Flood, I know you've done a lot of work in this space, and I'm keen to understand your thinking, your research around just some of those complexities and challenges that manifest itself, and what perhaps we can do to even, or not even try and address them, but even to have a conversation about some of those tonight with the panelists. And I'd also like to say to you all, please don't wait for me to jump in and ask questions. You know, if you want to jump in and add and build on a comment, feel free to do it. It's a conversation, but I think let's hear from you more so than me. So maybe Professor Flood, if you can just give us a bit of an insight around some of your research and where some of the things that you've discovered or things that have been compelling and insightful for you in that research that might be of interest.
Sure. And look, the first thing I should say is, please call me Michael. Let's
okay, Michael, no problem.
So, look, I mean, two things have happened in Australia that I think are really exciting. One is that there's been a shift towards a growing emphasis on the need to prevent men's violence against women before it's perpetrated. That is, as well as responding to victims and survivors, which we absolutely have to do and still have to do much better, and holding perpetrators to account. There's growing interest in how we stop that violence from happening in the first place. In other words, how we stop changing the social conditions that make perpetrators, how we make it less likely that boys and men will use violence against a girlfriend, against a partner, you know, against a woman in the street, and so on. So that's one shift, a shift towards primary prevention. And another shift that overlaps with that is a growing interest in engaging men and boys, in engaging men and boys in playing positive roles in preventing and reducing that violence. And when I started doing this work, which is literally 35 years ago, I used to spend a lot of time arguing for why we need to engage men and boys. Now I spend more time arguing for how to do that well, because there's growing recognition that most boys don't ever use violence against women and girls. But when that violence happens, when a girl or a woman experiences domestic or sexual violence, it's overwhelmingly by a guy, by a man. So the problem is a problem particularly of men's violence against women and girls. Second, there's growing recognition that the reason that some boys and men do use violence is shaped by masculinity. It's shaped by how they've learned to be men, what they've learned about girls, about relationships, about their own, about themselves as men. In other words, the kind of social expectations about being a man that they've grown up with. And the third realisation, which is, I suppose, a more optimistic one, is that boys and men have a positive role to play. That if boys and men can speak up, can take action, can address our own behaviour and challenge other men and so on, then that will really make change. So those two shifts have meant that the idea that we have to engage men and boys in playing positive roles in stopping violence against women is on the agenda. It's on the agenda for community groups, for the federal government, and so on. And I'm really excited to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. Comments, Matt? Any other builds on that, or your own observations in the work that you do?
I mean, I was reflecting on this before we got in here tonight, which is that Michael started 35 years ago, and we started 8 years ago, and we were ahead of the time at that point in time. I just first of all, Michael, just thank you for just paving the way for so much of the work.
it was grassroots groups like Men Against Sexual Assault. In fact, it was in Melbourne, Tarang. I happened to be in Melbourne in about 1993 and encountered this march of men, 400 men marching through the streets of Melbourne, addressing men's sexual assault of women, which was amazing. Sorry, back to you. Yeah.
Well, I think that's amazing because the point is you did start 35 years ago and you've built the work that's now the foundation for so much of what we know and understand about this work. You know, we started the work because we saw a gap in what we were teaching young men in schools. We're still looking at the education system only 8 years later. We've got things like teachers' consent coming on because of Chanel Contos's amazing work. We've got respect for relationships curriculum coming in, but we've also got an education system that is so under pressure, so understaffed and under-resourced that it's actually really hard to ask more teachers to do even more work in this space, let alone it's kind of weird. It would be weird for me to have my maths teacher teaching maths and then the next period teaching me around respect for relationships. And so we really need to change the way that we're approaching how we educate young men. And I've got an amazing example of a program we did out in regional Victoria recently. We do a game called Anonymous Questions. Now, this is the core part of the workshop. We've sort of done facilitated introductions. We've really built rapport with the boys. The middle session, we might hold an anonymous question circle where the boys can write down on a piece of paper any question they want to discuss with the group. And in this workshop, one of the questions that came out was, how do you talk to girls? And so we facilitated a discussion between the boys, as well as being hosted by our facilitators, around them having a really safe and honest conversation around, well, how do you actually do this? And my concern is that without that conversation having happened, where are they going to learn about these things? And the reality is they're either looking up to boys that are older than them, they're looking to movie stars to see how they do it, or they're looking to social media. And they are looking to people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and even Donald Trump. Because those men, as much as there are things that we dislike about what they might represent, they bring clarity to a really confusing time around what it means to be a man. And so young men can really latch onto those ideas because they make it feel simple and powerful. And I think we have to be careful to not just dismiss these figures and really continue to bring young men into the conversation because they're already feeling, I don't know what the right word is, but they're already feeling a bit alienated. Young men can feel that way. And so we just need to keep the conversation open and bringing them in, as much as I have to do my own work around that stuff as well, because I can get a bit heated when I reflect on the fact that those people are someone that young men are looking to. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts in response.
And I think it's really hard, right, Maddie? Like, it's kind of hard, right? Like, I've had young boys talk to me about Andrew Tate in particular, and then others a little older, you know, once they're in their kind of late teens or early 20s and they're in like tertiary education or they're getting their like first full-time jobs, and they'll get like Jordan Peterson's, you know, 10 rules for life, or his follow-up, like 10 more rules. I don't know what the second one's called, but it's like a follow-up to the first. And you know, some of the advice is actually, you know, nothing is objective in this life, but it's objectively not terrible advice. Like, get up and make your bed and work hard. You know, like that is, you know, most of us would have parents that encouraged us to work hard or to make our bed and, you know, start the day off well. And so some of these boys and young men are looking for, as you were talking about, guidance, right? They're looking for, what does it mean to be a man in an ever-changing landscape of gender relations? And this is sometimes the most relatable voice that they can latch onto. And I think that's why programs have to be around to support young boys, to give them avenues to understand the gamut of what masculinity can be. You know, we were talking before others joined the call about how a lot of masculinity is, you know, what boys don't do. You know, boys don't cry, or boys don't show emotion, or boys don't behave in particular ways. And I think the flip side of that is boys can, and all of the gamut of things that boys can do. They can cry, they can express emotion, they can, you know, start conversations with their friends around gender-based violence. And one of the things that I'm really conscious of when we're having these discussions around engaging boys and men is the need to do it in what I'd say is a feminist lens grounded in an idea of the existence of a patriarchal structure, right? And I think that's what's so important, that like we can't just stop at going, boys are talking about their mental health, because that's essential and great. And I would love the next step Mancave's doing this and others are doing this, and it's so great that this is happening. And it's getting boys engaged in the conversation around the mistreatment of women en masse, right? Of which men are overwhelmingly the people doing that. And I think that's the hardest part, right? Because there's a lot of self-awareness and self-reflection. I think that has to take place, and so we're asking a lot, when we're asking 14, 15-year-old boys to not only grapple with the experience of growing up, as boys and men in a complex world, but we're asking them to take stock of the situation of world affairs and actually understand structures and systems. So it's asking a lot, and I think it's therefore incumbent, particularly on men in positions of power who comparatively have enormous degrees of privilege, to exercise that for good. And if I can make one final little point on that, I think exercising it for good for the benefit of all women. I think one of my concerns about when we see coalitions of powerful men, they really open doors for women who are similarly powerful. Comparatively. And so for women of color or migrant women or gender diverse folks, they're sort of really still at the margins. And I lament that in 10 years' time we might look back and say, but why have we, we're closer to gender parity on this board, for example, but there's not a single woman of color, and it's kind of concerning that could happen on our watch. And I think it's really crucial that we be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, so often the conversations around power obviously linked to, violence and that, and are we perpetuating similar paradigms for the future that just happen to now have women of the same ilk recreating exactly the same construct that we have now. So I think that's a really, really interesting point. Michael, Matt, builds on that, your thoughts?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts.
There's so much in there. Yeah.
We've been talking about, education programs in schools or in community organisations, and that's one key strategy. A second key strategy, I think, is bigger though, is shifting the kind of social norms and the kind of cultures that that boys and men are socialised into. So there's really three things we have to do. First of all, I think we have to highlight the harm that some of the ways we socialise boys and men, or boys and men are socialised by media and parents and so on, the harms they involve. Harms to women and girls in terms of feeding into violence, but also the ways they limit boys and men's own lives. And Tarang's talked about how, in fact, I wasn't sure who it was, talked about kind of, messages about what it means to have sex or pick up girls and so on. They're not very useful for boys and men in terms of having healthy sexual and relationship lives. So we have to highlight the harms of those models of traditional masculinity. Second, we have to kind of weaken their cultural grip. And that does mean criticising media. It does mean criticising porn. It does mean criticising the kind of preachers of traditional masculinity, whether they're sporting coaches or shock jocks or media, social media influencers or others. Third thing we have to do is promote some kind of alternative, because boys and men can't be what they can't see. So we have to promote among boys and men visible, positive alternatives, healthy ways of being a man or being a person that are feminist, as Tarang said, that are built on gender equality, that are diverse. We don't want to replace just one model with another rigid model. We need diversity among boys and men. And third, that don't imply that the only positive values we can celebrate are exclusively only available to boys and men, and not also to girls and women. So whatever we do, we've got to challenge the kind of rigid norms of masculinity that are out there, because they're harmful for women, but they're also limiting for men ourselves, and promote positive, healthy alternatives to them.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, while we started out as a grassroots program, we're now looking at really meeting with government, advocating for funding and policy change to happen, so that not just so that Mancave can grow, but so that all the initiatives in this space can grow. So there's multiple levels of change that are required, and it also needs to happen at a community level. There's a lot of social norms that are still reinforced by previous generations that served those generations, that helped them get through what they need to get through, that are no longer serving our young men and more broadly our young people. And so challenging these stereotypes, the hard thing about that is it really requires us as adults to challenge our own conditioning and to recognize how we're passing it on. Now, I'm not yet a father or a parent. I hope to be, but I know I'm going to go through that journey as soon as I have a child, of realizing I'm passing on some of the conditioning that maybe isn't too helpful. And so, I mean, we saw this as well, and we looked at marketing as one area. And I don't know if you guys remember Links Africa, but it's still a thing. And the advertising used to be, you spray this and women will flock to you like they're magnets. Flock to you, and that advertising is still happening. And so how are we, meant to help? We might help young men in one conversation in one day in a few programs, but they go back out and that's still the messaging they're seeing. One of the ways we tried to address it is we started our own skincare brand called Stuff. Stuff for men, stuff for your pits, stuff for your bits. It's a bit cheeky, but it's designed to be a brand that young men can look to and feel inspired by, and that can actually also help fund some of the Man Cave programs. So that's now going and available in Woolworths and different brands. But I think the most important thing is, to Michael's point, it's what young men can't be what they can't see. That's men in particular, that's women, that's role models, but it's also in the broader sphere,
Sorry, I'm losing you.
Yeah, I'm losing Maddie as well.
Sorry, Matt, maybe just repeat the last line or your last comment.
Sorry.
We just missed you. You just faded out a bit there.
Sorry. Mum just called and I had to decline her call. So
hang on. You always pick up your mother's call.
Always
that's it.
You
lost it.
Call, Maddie.
Exactly. I'm happy for you to step out to talk to Mum.
I missed the point, didn't I?
Stuff for your bits, stuff for your bits, your pits, your something, and it's a bit cheeky and fun program. No, I think that's
Thanks,
when Maddie said about Links Africa and it getting the girls. I can wholeheartedly confirm, as a childhood user of Links Africa, it does not do what it says on the box. It is grossly ineffective.
And have you smelt it? Yeah. It's not pleasant.
I've not only smelt it, I've used it in my youth. But I think the broader point around popular culture is key, right? And we're seeing certain shifts around how popular culture and men in popular culture are speaking out about, the issue of male violence. But I think that in Australia we're quite far behind in terms of public-facing male figures taking an active stance. I'm a cricket tragic. Like I live for cricket, and I don't know if it's because Indian background and everything, but I've grown up on cricket. I still watch cricket. When I'm at work, I've got like multiple tabs of all the scores open in the background. It's sort of like my life, and I remember seeing a video about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was the then Indian cricket captain Virat Kohli doing a video. And he was saying, I just want to wish everyone, and he has like 91 million Instagram followers. And he was saying something like, I just want to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day. And then he started highlighting some of the statistics. And there's someone behind the camera, and the video is purposefully released a day early. And they go, oh, no, it's tomorrow. Like, no, you don't, it's the wrong day, right? And he goes, hang on a minute. Why is it not today? Why isn't it yesterday and the day after? Why isn't every day a day that we should be respecting women? And I thought it was like a cheeky 15-second video. And I just thought how powerful that in a country, with 1.3 billion people, with hundreds of millions of young women and girls, that you have a powerful male figure speaking to the need to respect women every day, not just on particular landmark days. And I just thought, how powerful would it be if we had an AFL footballer or somebody come out with such a public stance, like, that was really evocative and spoke to men. And that's one of the challenges that we have to simultaneously accept where boys and men get their messages from. And sport is one such example. It can be others. But in a culture we can't ignore that. So we have to find the balance of, and it's, and it's never clear and it's not always easy, but we have to find ways to, I think Matt used this line earlier, like get to boys, get to men where they're at, but then extend the conversation, get them feeling a little bit vulnerable.
Can I just ask, why do you think that is? Why do you think there aren't more men in positions of, with a great voice, with, ability to amplify and inform this debate more broadly? Why do you think we're not hearing those voices as much as possibly we could or should?
For me, it's a few things. And I think this is what stops lots of men from speaking up at all. One is the sense that, it's an important issue, but it's a women's issue. I think lots of men don't have a sense of how they're personally implicated in the issue or how it's relevant to them, even though it impacts pretty much every woman and girl around them. Second, I think there's a gender gap in understanding, a gender gap in recognition of the problem. Every round of survey on Australian people's attitudes finds that men tend to have poorer attitudes than women. Understandably, women are more aware of issues of domestic and sexual violence. And third, I think often us men overestimate other men's tolerance or other men's support for sexism and violence. So the six of us at the pub, one of the blokes in the group makes a kind of sleazy joke or says that some woman asks to be assaulted or something. Probably four of the other men in the group think that's rubbish, but none of them speak up because they all assume they're the only one who thinks that's rubbish. So the guy who's made the joke or the comment, he thinks, oh, everyone agrees with me. Probably the one other person who does agree with him thinks, oh, we all agree. And the four men, in fact, the 2/3 of men who think, no, that's sexist, that's victim blaming, none of them speak up, and we all overestimate each other's tolerance for this. So there's a few things that stop us from speaking up, but the fact that there are some high-profile men and ordinary men, everyday men, starting to speak up and take action tells us it is possible to move past that. It is possible for men to realise that violence against women is a men's issue. It's a men's issue because it impacts the women and girls we care about. It's a men's issue because the violence that some men do gives all of us a bad name. If I'm walking down the street at night behind a woman, she may be thinking, is he going to assault me? Is he following me? And so on, very understandably. And it's a men's issue because it's often the men we know, men we like, our mates, or even ourselves, that are using that violence. So there's all kinds of ways that at least some men in Australia are starting to realise this is an issue we have to do something about.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I love that, Michael. And I think, one thing that we've always tried to do at Man Cave is create a really safe culture for our team as well. And I remember, a year or two ago, one of our staff came in, we do a morning check-in every morning, and she said to us, last night I was actually followed home by a man after this event, and followed him all the way to her home, and felt really unsafe. And it was a good 15-minute walk. And for most of us at that point in time, this is only a few years ago, we had no idea that stuff actually happened to people that we knew. And so we then asked the rest of the women in our team, has this happened to each of you as well? And all of them said yes. And we then had a conversation about, well, how and why is this happening? We had no idea as men because we don't worried about our physical safety ourselves. And it was a really enlightening moment for us to realize what our female peers go through on a daily basis. And so I think part of it is also hearing stories and hearing examples and realizing this is a real threat to women that we know and love. And I think the other part I'll add as well is, a lot of what motivates, I think there's unfortunately still a casualness to Australian culture that means that we don't want to rock the boat or raise an issue that's going to make things not so hunky-dory and easygoing. And so anything that makes things a bit too serious is kind of knocked over. But I also think as men, there's quite a lot at risk, unfortunately, still for speaking up against this stuff. And I see this with the boys that we work with. There's thousands of boys we work with. All of them at the very heart are beautiful boys that want to become great men. But there's so much pressure on them to fit into the group. And they'll do anything that's required to make sure they're not kicked out of the boys group. Because if that happens, the rest of their school life is going to be pretty challenging. And unfortunately, that continues into adulthood as well. And like you said, Michael, 4 out of those 6 men don't agree with what's being said. but there's something that's just stopping that one person saying it. And I think, well, it's one of my hypotheses, and I'm sure you've got a better idea than I do from all the research as well, is there's just too much at risk. There's too much at risk for them to actually say something. And that's a big question about how we solve that. I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's a group thing. I think there's a few different ways we need to approach it.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you so much. We had planned on speaking for about 30 minutes. We've now gone over time. I'm not there's so many, I could literally talk to you all night. But I might just, if there are any comments or anything that you saw earlier in the chat in terms of any of the speakers that you would like to comment on, and if there's any questions you wanted to particularly address, Matt, any of the speakers, Michael, Tarang, we can have a chat about those now. I know that there were some comments in there about the situation in Iran, because today we have obviously very much focused on what's happening in Australia, and the issue of violence against women is pervasive globally. And that is something obviously that UN Women works in, along with a whole lot of other organisations who are looking similarly to address the similar issues, but obviously in a different cultural, geographical context. Unfortunately, the situation is quite similar across the globe in terms of women at risk and the degrees with which we're all trying to engage each other in conversations in this. So I think it's incredibly important that men are part of the conversation and need to be because, as you said, for young boys to see role models, to understand that, to hear from men's mouths and to be able to challenge their own behaviours, they need to be able to model that off someone and someone of their own gender and people that they look up to, whether it's the sports people, whether it's, family members, fathers, mothers, and how we talk about violence, etc. So there's so many things there's so many different ways we can come at this conversation. And I just hope that if we're still having this conversation in 5 or 10 years' time, that certainly the indicators that we now have in Australia around the number of women at risk of violence are significantly reduced, because the statistics are fairly damning, as we all know. So I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time out to have this conversation with us, to continue your amazing work wherever we can. We will support and amplify that. Part of tomorrow, I'm actually joining a roundtable on gender equality and the role of how we engage men with the federal government, which should be very interesting. There's a lot of conversations around this. Sorry?
I'll see you there. I'll be there as well.
Fabulous. We'll be besties by the end of the week. But, really important to keep these conversations going. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your evening to contribute to that conversation and for the incredible work that you all do every day. It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. And let's keep the good fight. And thank you for your contribution to that. We're not going to solve it tonight, but I'm pretty confident with us all, aligning around it, we can certainly change the face of violence against women and men more broadly as a nation. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you who have joined us. It's most of our first Instagram live, so we now figure that we are, experts in this, so we'll be doing this every week. No, I'm only joking, but hopefully we'll be able to do some more of these, because it's great to have a conversation and to get these things out into the universe. So I hope you can all take away something from this conversation this evening, put it into practice, and let's turn 16 days of activism into 365 days of action. If there's anything we can take away from tonight, that's what I would ask you all to do. So take care. Thanks again to our panelists. Talk soon, and look forward to hearing more about your amazing work. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you.
Thank you, Simone. Well hosted.
Thank you.
Take care, guys. See you.
ya.
Bye.